The valley of the Rhone was still choked with smoke when the survivors staggered back toward Rome. They did not march as soldiers. They limped as shadows, their armor twisted, their faces pale as ash. What they carried was not victory, but the memory of one of the greatest disasters the Republic had ever endured. Orazio, a name that would become a scar. In the autumn of 105 BC, two Roman armies, more than 100,000 strong, were swallowed in a single day. The Teutons and Cimbri, wandering tribes from the far north, had broken them as easily as pottery smashed upon stone. The river ran red. The fields were littered with the bodies of citizens and slaves alike, and even the carrion birds circled wide, overwhelmed by abundance. News reached Rome faster than the survivors themselves. A city built on triumphs suddenly tasted humiliation. Senators whispered of omens, lightning striking temples, statues bleeding in the forum. Mothers locked their doors, fearing that the northern tribes would soon march all the way to the capital. And everywhere, in every tavern, in every bathhouse, in every cramped alley of Subura, one question burned like fever. Had Rome's destiny ended? The Senate searched desperately for someone to blame. They found two men, Consul Malleus Maximus and Proconsul Scipio, commanders who had quarreled like spoiled children on the eve of battle. Their arrogance had left the army divided, their refusal to cooperate sealing the fate of tens of thousands. In the aftermath, Scipio was cursed as a traitor, Malleus as a fool. But condemnation did not raise the dead. Rome needed salvation, and salvation rarely comes from the expected place. Amid the chaos, a name began to stir, Gaius Marius. He was not patrician, not gilded with the long lineages of Rome's elite. He was an outsider, born in the rough soil of Arpinum, son of farmers rather than senators. Yet his eyes held the hunger of a man who had clawed his way upward, and his career was marked by a string of victories in Numidia against the cunning King Jugurtha. Soldiers loved him, rivals feared him. He did not carry the arrogance of heritage, but the fire of ambition. And so, in a Rome teetering on the edge of collapse, Marius was chosen. Consul once more, given the impossible charge of rebuilding the army from its broken fragments. But what army was left to rebuild? The traditional legions had always been drawn from Rome's landowning citizens, men who farmed their fields by spring and returned to war each summer. But those fields now lay empty, their owners buried at Orazio. The rolls of potential recruits shrank. The Republic stood defenseless, as if naked before the coming storm. Marius saw what the Senate could not admit. The old ways were dying. Rome could not be defended by ghosts. If the Republic was to live, its armies must be reborn. And so he broke tradition. He threw open the gates of enlistment to the Capites and sea, the landless poor who had never been trusted with shield or sword. These were men who owned nothing but the breath in their lungs, men who lived in crumbling tenements and worked as day laborers, who had never before been considered worthy to defend the state. Now, Marius promised them something no senator ever had, a place in the legions, steady pay, and the possibility of land upon victory. When the first of these recruits lined up on the parade ground, Rome gasped in scandal. To the nobility, it looked like desperation, even sacrilege. But to the poor, it was a miracle. And in those dusty fields outside the city walls, a transformation began. Helmets gleamed under the sun, all of one shape, all of one size. Shields no longer painted with a farmer's crest, but identical, disciplined rectangles. Spears short, heavy, designed to bend upon impact so the enemy could not throw them back. The eagle, the Aquila, rose as the single standard of every legion, replacing the jumble of beasts and symbols. The men marched together, drilled together, bled together. Rome's new army was no longer a seasonal militia. It was a machine, a profession, a force that existed not just for defense, but for conquest. Yet beneath this rebirth lay a shadow. These men owed their loyalty not to the Senate that had scorned them, nor to the land they did not own, but to the general who had given them purpose. Marius was not simply forging soldiers. He was forging personal power. And still, north of the Alps, the Teutons marched. They were not a mere army, but a people on the move, warriors, yes, but also wives, children, wagons, herds. A tide of humanity pressing southward, vast and restless. To Rome, they were a nightmare that could not be reasoned with. And unless Marius's new legions could stop them, the fate of Orazio would repeat, not at the Rhone, but at the very gates of the Eternal City. Thus the stage was set. A wounded republic, a controversial general, and a storm of barbarians sweeping down from the north. The question was no longer whether Rome would fight. It was whether Rome would survive. The Alps loomed like jagged teeth against the northern sky, and beyond them, the storm was gathering. Word spread not in whispers, but in waves of panic. The Teutons and their allies had crossed the rivers of Gaul, their wagons creaking like thunder, their campfires lighting valleys that had never seen so many souls. This was no ordinary invasion. This was a migration, an avalanche of humanity moving southward. Warriors strode at the front, their shields painted with curling beasts, their axes dark with rust and blood. Behind them came the wagons, tall, lumbering fortresses on wheels, laden with women, children, livestock, and the remnants of entire villages pulled from the earth. To the Romans, it was an image out of nightmare, an enemy that was not only armed, but rooted, bringing with it the weight of a nation that refused to stop. Farmers in northern Italy abandoned their fields. Merchants locked their stalls in Massilia, fleeing inland. Refugees poured into Roman towns, carrying stories of massacres and the chilling war songs of the Teutons, chants that echoed through the night and rattled the hearts of all who heard them. Back in Rome, the Senate chamber quaked with arguments. Senators called for walls to be strengthened, garrisons doubled, envoys sent to bribe or bargain. But beneath their bluster lay a truth no one dared speak aloud. Rome had already failed once. If Marius failed again, there would be no second chance. Marius, however, wasted no breath on politics. While the Senate quarreled, he drilled. From dawn until the last light of dusk, the fields outside Rome thundered with the rhythm of marching feet. Marius's recruits, men who had once begged for bread in the forum, now bore their shields in perfect unison. He punished weakness, rewarded discipline, and drove his soldiers like a blacksmith hammering iron. They cursed him, feared him, even hated him, but they obeyed. And slowly, something began to change. The men who had once shuffled into camp barefoot and gaunt now stood taller, their legs hardened by endless marches. Calloused hands no longer fumbled with the short sword. They struck with precision, as if the blade had grown from their arm. For the first time, the poor of Rome felt not like shadows lurking at the edges of society, but like the very spine of the Republic. Yet Marius was no mere soldier's general. He understood the mind as well as the body. He gathered his men beneath the banner of the Aquila, the eagle cast in bronze, gleaming in the torchlight. This, he told them, is no ornament. This is Rome itself. Lose it, and you lose not only your lives, but the very soul of the legion. The men roared, not with the voices of beggars, but of warriors who believed themselves chosen. Still, the shadow of Orazio clung to them. Many had fathers or brothers who had perished there, their bones still lying unburied in Gallic soil. Around campfires, soldiers whispered that the Teutons were not men at all, but giants, demons from beyond the world of mortals. The fear was real, gnawing at the edges of discipline like rot. Marius countered with cunning. He reminded his men that numbers did not decide battles, order did. That chaos was the Teuton strength, but also their doom. He drilled them in sudden maneuvers, in feigned retreats, and ambushes. He prepared them not only to fight, but to outthink. And then came the reports from scouts. The Teutons were moving south in greater numbers than Rome had dared imagine. Their columns stretched for miles, a river of wagons and warriors rolling inexorably toward Italy. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath their weight. Villages that resisted were crushed. Fields stripped bare. Rivers choked with bodies, both the conquered and the stubborn who refused to join. In the Senate, some despaired. But in the camps of Marius, the effect was the opposite. Fear hardened into determination. If Rome faltered now, it would not just lose a battle, it would lose its very identity. Marius said little, but his silence was more powerful than speeches. He knew what his soldiers did not, that history was turning on a knife's edge. If the Teutons crossed the passes and reached the Italian heartland, the Republic could not hold. The cities would starve, the countryside burn, and Rome's name would be spoken only as a memory of fallen greatness. And so he began to move his legions northward, 6 in all, 35,000 men. Not yet to fight, but to wait, to choose ground as carefully as a hunter stalking prey. He would not meet the Teutons in open fields, where sheer numbers could smother Rome. He would force them into terrain where their multitudes became a curse. Some soldiers asked when the battle would come. Marius only answered, "When the gods themselves grant us the ground." And so they marched, silent but ready, toward a fate that would decide whether Rome lived or vanished into the dust of history. The summer heat clung heavy over southern Gaul, turning every breath into labor. Dust rose in clouds as Marius's 6 legions dug trenches, raised palisades, and carved a fortified camp into the hillside near the town of Aquae Sextii. To passing eyes, it looked like preparation for a siege. But for Marius, it was a mask. He was not waiting to defend. He was waiting to strike. From the ridges, Roman scouts returned with trembling voices. The Teutons were coming, not in thousands, but in tens of thousands, an unbroken tide. The column stretched as far as the eye could see, banners snapping in the wind, oxen groaning beneath carts, children riding atop heaps of furs and tools, warriors marching in glittering ranks. Their laughter carried on the wind, deep and fearless. They did not look like a people burdened by fear of Rome. They looked like a people certain of victory. And then came the shock. They did not attack. Day after day, the Teutons passed by the Roman position, filing along the valley floor like a river flowing beneath the cliffs. They mocked the legionaries from below, hurling insults in rough Latin, shouting that they would see them in Rome itself, that their women were already weaving garlands to crown Teutonic champions in the Forum. Warriors beat their shields in rhythm, daring Marius to descend and fight. But Marius did not move. His men stood behind their fortifications, their jaws clenched, watching the enemy march past in an endless stream. Some soldiers bit their tongues until they bled, unable to bear the humiliation. To do nothing felt like cowardice. Yet Marius's orders were iron. Hold. Wait. It was then that whispers began to spread, not among the Teutons, but within the Roman camp. Could their general be afraid? Had the man who rebuilt Rome's army now lost his nerve? Marius heard the whispers. He allowed them to fester. He needed his soldiers not merely eager for battle, but starving for it. He wanted their fury sharpened to a knife's edge. For 6 days the Teutons filed past, a torrent of humanity flowing southward. When the last wagons finally disappeared into the distance, silence fell over the hills. Dust hung in the air like a veil. The legions stood restless, as if the chance had slipped through their fingers. That night, Marius gathered his officers. His face, lit by the glow of a single torch, was unreadable. "They believe we have yielded," he said. "They believe Rome is weak. That is our strength." He revealed his plan. A detachment of 3,000 men would break away under cover of darkness, slipping into the forest behind the Teutonic line. There, Hidden among the pines, they would wait like wolves. When the Teutons finally turned to strike Rome, the trap would snap shut, not only from the front but from the rear. The officers listened in silence. It was bold, dangerous. If a hidden force was discovered, it would be slaughtered. If the timing failed, the legions could be crushed between hammer and anvil. But Marius had already decided. The detachment slipped into the night, leaving only silence in their wake. The remaining legions braced themselves. They sharpened blades, tightened shields, whispered prayers to Mars and Fortuna. Then came dawn. The Teutons turned back. Their scouts had seen the Roman camp. This time they would not pass by. They would storm the hill and break the legions once and for all. The valley trembled with their approach. Drums pounded like thunder. Horns blared, shrill and wild. The Teutonic warriors surged uphill, their shields clattering, their war cries splitting the air. Behind them, women and children shouted encouragement, a chorus of voices driving the men forward. The Romans stood waiting at the crest, shields interlocked, pilae poised. The sun burned off the mist, revealing two worlds colliding, one an avalanche of raw fury, the other a wall of discipline. Then Marius raised his hand. 1,000 javelins arced into the sky, a storm of iron raining down upon the charging Teutons. Shields splintered, bodies crumpled, but still they climbed, snarling, relentless. The Roman line shuddered beneath the impact of so many warriors hurling themselves upward. Steel clanged, men screamed, the hillside turned to a slick of blood and dust. And then, from the forested rear, a roar erupted. The hidden detachment burst forth, slamming into the Teutons' unguarded backs. Panic rippled through their ranks. What had moments ago been a tide of unstoppable force was suddenly a trap sprung with merciless precision. The Romans roared as they pressed forward, every sword stroke a cry of vengeance for Orazio. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, the Teutons caught between two fires. Women and children shrieked as the wagons behind them jammed the valley, sealing off retreat. It was not yet victory. It was slaughter in the making. For the first time, the Teutons knew fear. The trap had been sprung, but the battle was far from finished. What began as a roar of triumph soon dissolved into the grinding, endless struggle of men locked in blood and iron. The Teutons, though caught, did not break easily. They fought like wolves cornered by fire, turning with sudden ferocity upon the Romans at their rear. Massive warriors with hair bound in lime-soaked spikes swung axes wide enough to cleave through two men at once. The hillside shook as their war cries thundered, echoing off the ridges like some savage hymn. From the Roman line, the clash was unbearable. Shields splintered, men staggered backward beneath the weight of the charge. Centurions shouted themselves hoarse, driving their cohorts to hold steady. The scuta locked again, the wall of shields reformed, but each impact sent tremors through the line. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and iron, a suffocating haze. At the center, Marius stood among his soldiers, not above them. His cloak was spattered, his face streaked with grime. He barked orders with the precision of a man who had rehearsed every heartbeat of this battle in his mind. Yet even he could feel it, the thin edge upon which they balanced. Victory or annihilation, there was no middle ground. "Hold!" he thundered, voice breaking through the chaos. "Rome holds." But holding was agony. The hillside became a cauldron of bodies. Men pressed so tightly that there was no room to swing, only to stab, to thrust, to gasp for breath. Romans pushed forward with their gladii, short swords stabbing into the gaps of the Teutonic shields. For every warrior that fell, another pressed in, driving the Romans back with raw muscle and rage. Above the din, a scream cut through. A Roman cohort had faltered. A wedge of Teutons burst through, hacking, tearing their advance like a spearhead thrust into the heart of the legion. For one dreadful moment, The line seemed about to break. Panic rippled down the ranks. Soldiers glimpsed the memory of Orazio in the wild eyes of their comrades. The moment when order gave way to rout. Marius saw it too. He pushed forward, seizing a fallen standard. He lifted the eagle high, its bronze wings catching the sun. "Romans!" he bellowed, his voice ragged but unyielding. "Do you see this? This is not theirs. This is yours. Rome does not yield." A cheer erupted, raw and desperate, but enough. The line steadied. The cohorts surged back, closing the breach, driving the Teutons into the press. The eagle gleamed above the chaos, a reminder that Rome's soul was at stake. But for all their valor, the enemy was relentless. Behind the warriors, wagons creaked as women and children screamed. The valley floor became a trap within a trap. Teutonic fighters tried to push backward, to carve a path of retreat, but found themselves crushed between their own fleeing masses and the advancing Romans. Horses reared, oxen toppled wagons, screams of rage and terror mingled into a single, unbroken cacophony. From the ridges, the hidden Roman detachment pressed harder, cutting off the exits. The Teutons had nowhere to go but forward, into the wall of steel waiting for them. What had been bold defiance an hour earlier was now desperation. Marius felt the shift. He could see it in the way enemy warriors glanced over their shoulders, the way their rhythm faltered. The moment was close, but still fragile. A single collapse of discipline could undo everything. He turned to his officers. "Release the reserves." Fresh cohorts, hidden until now, poured into the flanks. Their arrival slammed against the Teutons like a hammer against an anvil. The enemy line, already straining, buckled under the weight. Panic spread as warriors realized they were surrounded not just by men, but by inevitability. And yet, victory tasted bitter. The Romans were not fighting an army alone. They were dismantling an entire people. Marius saw women hurling stones, children clutching knives, old men staggering into the fray with farming tools. This was no clean contest of soldiers. It was a collapse of a nation, a people crumbling under the grinding jaws of Rome. One of Marius's aides, bloodied and pale, whispered, "Is this war? Or is this slaughter?" Marius did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the valley below, where wagons overturned, flames crackled, and screams carried on the wind. He knew the truth. He had forged this army to save the Republic, but in its efficiency, it had become something else, a blade that cut not only armies but civilizations. Still, he raised his arm, signaling the advance. There was no room for hesitation now. Rome demanded not survival, but annihilation. The valley narrowed, the noose tightened, and the Teutons, once triumphant wanderers, found themselves drowning in their own numbers. The climax was near. The sun hung low, bleeding orange light across the valley, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the carnage below. The battle was no longer a contest of skill or courage. It had become an unrelenting storm of death, where survival itself was a vanishing hope. The Teutons, trapped in the narrowing gorge, thrashed like a wounded beast. Warriors swung their axes with desperate fury, cutting down Romans even as they were cut down in turn. Mothers clutched children to their breasts, stumbling between wagons, only to be swallowed in the crush of bodies. Oxen screamed, collapsing under toppled carts, their carcasses blocking escape. The air was thick with smoke, iron, and the stench of fear. Marius stood on the ridge above it all, watching the tide break against the walls he had built. His soldiers were relentless, methodical like a grinding wheel that crushed everything fed into it. Cohorts advanced step by step, shields locking, blades stabbing in unison, pushing the enemy into tighter and tighter knots. The Teutons' war cries shifted from rage to terror. They had marched through Gaul like gods, unbeaten, unstoppable. Now they were pinned animals, clawing at each other for space to breathe. The battlefield had become a slaughter pen, the valley a coffin with no lid. And then came the moment that marked the end. At the center of the chaos, the Teutonic king, his name lost in the roar of history, climbed onto a shattered wagon, blood streaking his face, his cloak in tatters. He raised his sword to the sky and bellowed a final cry. It was not in victory, nor in plea, but in defiance, a refusal to bow even as the world collapsed around him. His warriors rallied for a heartbeat, surging forward in one last desperate wave. The Romans met it with silence. No cheer, no roar, only the grinding rhythm of shields and steel. The king leapt into their ranks, swinging wildly, his sword shattering on a Roman shield. He fell beneath the press, vanishing like a stone dropped into the sea. The wave broke. The Teutons broke with it. What followed was not battle. It was unraveling. Men dropped their weapons, fleeing toward the ravines, only to find Roman cohorts waiting. Families clambered onto wagons, lashing oxen into madness, only to tip into ditches and burst into flames. Children wailed, crushed underfoot by the press of bodies. Rivers ran dark as warriors tried to swim across, only to drown beneath the weight of their armor and the chaos of stampeding cattle. The noose tightened until there was nothing left to tighten. By nightfall, the valley was silent save for the crackle of burning wood and the groans of the dying. Of the 100,000 who had marched south, almost none remained. The Teutons had ceased to exist. The Romans had lost thousands, but compared to Orazio, their casualties were light. Cohorts still stood in formation, bloodied but unbroken, their banners raised high above the ruin. For them, it was vindication, Rome avenged. But for Marius, triumph carried no sweetness. He walked the field in silence, stepping over corpses, past the twisted remnants of wagons and the shattered remains of lives. He saw the eyes of children staring blankly at the sky, the hands of women still clutching scraps of bread or cloth as if clinging to a vanished home. He had promised Rome salvation. He had delivered it. But in doing so, he had erased an entire people from the earth. His officers rode up, saluting. Victory, Imperator! The Republic is saved. Marius did not answer. He gazed out over the valley, the fires painting the night with flickering gold. The cries of the wounded rose around him, mingling with the silence of the dead. It was victory, yes, but it was also annihilation. And in that moment, he understood. The army he had built was more than Rome's salvation. It was Rome's future and its curse. For soldiers who owed loyalty only to him, not to the Senate, had carried out this miracle of destruction. The Republic had been saved by the very thing that would one day unravel it. The eagle standard gleamed in the firelight, raised above the field of the dead. Rome would march on, stronger than before. But the ground beneath Aquae Sextii would never forget. The Teutons had come as a tide. They had left as silence. Dawn came slow to the valley of Aquae Sextii. The smoke had thinned, but the air still carried the bitter tang of ash and iron. Across the field, vultures wheeled in patient circles, descending upon a harvest too vast for their wings. The silence was almost holy, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the steady tramp of Roman boots patrolling among the corpses. It was victory, yes, but victory had a sound, and this was not it. The survivors among the Teutons, few enough to count by the hundreds, were rounded into pens, their faces hollow with shock. Some begged for mercy, others stared blankly into nothing, their eyes already elsewhere. Women, stripped of weapons, lifted their children toward the Romans, as if offering them up would buy them life. History would later whisper of how many of those women chose death instead, throwing themselves and their young into rivers, preferring the cold embrace of water to chains and slavery. The legions, bloodied but intact, raised their standards high. To the soldiers, this was vindication. Rome, humiliated at Orazio, had not only avenged itself, but had proved unbreakable. They cheered for Marius, hailing him as the third founder of Rome. But when the cries of triumph faded, what remained was not pride, it was unease. Marius himself lingered on the ridge, watching the sun rise over the killing ground. His armor was dented, his cloak torn, his hands blackened with grime. Yet his gaze was fixed not on the banners of victory, but on the valley of the dead. He had promised salvation and delivered annihilation. And in the echoes of battle, he heard a truth that chilled even him. Rome had discovered not merely how to endure, but how to obliterate. That truth would not be forgotten. In the years to come, Marius's reforms would be praised as genius, studied by every commander who followed. But they would also unravel the Republic. By tying soldiers' loyalty not to the Senate, but to their general, Marius had planted a seed that would grow into civil wars, dictators, and emperors crowned by legions rather than law. The road from Aquae Sextii did not end in triumph alone. It stretched forward to Sulla, to Caesar, to the death of the Republic itself. For now, though, Rome exulted. News raced across the provinces. The northern terror had been destroyed in a single battle. Cities rang with celebration. Temples filled with offerings. Mothers wept not in fear, but in relief. The Republic lived, and in that moment, it seemed immortal. But memory is a double-edged sword. Those who had seen Orazio remembered fields of Roman dead, vultures fattened on citizens' flesh. Those who had seen Aquae Sextii remembered fields of Teutonic dead, wagons burned, children drowned in rivers of their mothers' choosing. Victory and catastrophe mirrored each other, bound by blood. Rome had survived, but what of its soul? As night fell once more over the valley, the campfires of the legions burned bright, scattered stars across the darkened earth. Soldiers drank and boasted, their voices loud, but none could drown out the silence of the dead that hung beyond the walls. Marius walked alone between the fires, his figure swallowed by shadow. He was hailed as savior, yet he knew the weight of what he had wrought. He had remade Rome's army, yes, but in doing so, he had remade Rome itself. The Republic would never again be the same fragile balance of farmers and citizens. It had become a beast with iron teeth, and beasts do not rest quietly. He stopped at the edge of the valley, where the bodies lay thickest. The eagle standard stood beside him, gleaming in the firelight, a bronze silhouette against the dark. Marius looked at it, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered, was this symbol of unity also the shadow of Rome's undoing? No answer came, only the wind, carrying the faint cries of carrion birds. In time, history would celebrate this day as Rome's rebirth. But to those who stood upon the ground, who smelled the blood and smoke, who saw the faces of children in death, they knew it for what it truly was, not rebirth, but transformation. Rome had stepped from the brink of extinction, yes, but it had crossed another brink as well, into something harder, colder, more ruthless than before. The valley of Aquae Sextii was not only the grave of the Teutons. It was the cradle of the Rome to come.